Welcome to the Bible Made Clear. Today we're going to go over the book of Genesis, and that is the book of beginnings. So this is the first book in the Bible, and it is the first book of the law. The law is the first 5 books of the Bible. Really everything in the Old Testament is based on these first 5 books. It's typically an expansion of, interpretation of, or application of what we find in these 5 books. So this would be the foundational book for the law, and important because really the rest of the Bible won't make any sense without it. So as we follow on, the basic overview of Genesis gives us 2 divisions. The first is the creation of the world, and that is chapters 1 through 11. Now this is actual history. It's been criticized as being mythological or just allegorical story. However, the detail that is there, the locations, the names, the events that are listed are absolutely unnecessary unless it's actual history. And we believe it is such, and the evidence tells us that it is such. The second part of Genesis is the creation of a nation. We're talking about the nation of Israel. And so as we go through, we'll find that we have some key people that fall in these first 11 chapters. We have Adam and Eve, chapters 1 and 2, which we believe, again, are real people. We don't accept the mythological version that it is sometimes presented by those who actually don't believe the Bible or claim to believe the Bible, yet try to make them mythological people. So we believe that just like Jesus Christ referred to Adam, and so did Paul the Apostle, they obviously realized that they were real people, and so we take them as such. They are ultimately everybody's parents, whether everybody likes that or not. Cain and Abel in chapter 4. Cain is the one that slew his brother. We have Seth in chapter 5. And Seth is important because this establishes the line of Jesus Christ, or the line of the Messiah, from early on in Genesis right up until his birth. We have Enoch in chapter 5 also. Enoch was the first person to not see death, left the world, but was translated because he had a testimony that he pleased God. Then we have in chapter 6 to 9, we're introduced to Noah with his sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, which obviously Noah built the ark, and his sons and their wives, and Noah's wife was on with them. So those 8 people were the only ones that survived the flood. And so we are, again, just related to them in one fashion or another. We have Nimrod introduced in chapter 10. Nimrod was the first person to really incite a rebellion against God, an organized rebellion where he built the Tower of Babel, which was really an attempt at idolatry, universal idolatry, worshiping the heavens. And so the chapter ends with Terah, who is Abram's father, who would later be named Abraham, and Haran, who was one of Abraham's brothers, which the city of Haran is named after. He died there, and when they were on their way from Ur of the Chaldees, which is over in the Babylonian area, back over to the land of Canaan, when God called him, and then Lot, his nephew, also traveled with them. So next we have chapters 12 through 50. And again, the key people that we see there is Abraham and Sarah. Abraham is introduced as the father of Israel. God calls him from the Ur of the Chaldees, married to Sarah. And Lot, the nephew, he's introduced to us in chapter 13, going down to Sodom. Melchizedek, interesting character. He's introduced in chapter 14. When Abraham's returning from the War of the Kings, he ends up paying a tithe to Melchizedek. Now, Melchizedek was a Jebusite king that was a king of righteousness in a place called Salem, a city later to be named Jerusalem, the city of peace. So um, he ends up being a type of Christ because of the way he appears in Scripture. He just arrives on the scene. So he's not given the typical genealogy, and it's not talked about anywhere that he dies. So the writer in Hebrews picks this up, quotes Psalm 110, talking about the oath of God, you're a priest forever after the order of Melchizedek, and using the scriptures together, the only two times in the Old Testament that Melchizedek is mentioned, which is here in Genesis 14 and Psalm 110, then the writer of Hebrews puts that together and shows that Jesus is of a different order of priest, not like the Levitical priests that were just one after the other, and then because of your genealogy, you became a priest, but one that just is there. And so without beginning of days or end of life, in other words, an eternal priesthood, and Melchizedek is used as a type there. It's quite fascinating. Next is Hagar. She was the maidservant we're introduced to in chapter 16 that had gone down to Abraham and Sarah went down to Egypt during a famine and picked up Hagar, came back and attempted to actually fulfill the promise of God through Hagar, through having a child with her because Sarah could not get pregnant. And Ishmael was born. Now, Ishmael represents the flesh. He is a product of Abraham trying to work with human effort in order to accomplish the promises of God, which is not possible. That's something God has to do. God had promised that he would provide the nation of Israel through Abraham's son, Isaac. So next we're introduced to Isaac and Rebekah, chapter 23 to 35. And Isaac is the promised son of Abraham. So Esau, we find that he is the father of the Edomites. He is born to Isaac and Rebekah, and his twin brother, Jacob, who eventually married Rachel. They ended up being at odds with one another, which we'll discuss in a moment. But they were introduced in chapter 25 through mostly the end of the book. And then finally, Jacob has his 12 sons, which end up being the patriarchs of the fathering the 12 tribes of Israel. And that is how the nation of Israel is birthed, through those 12 men. So now, as we expand out in chapters 1 through 11, we see first we have the creation week in chapters 1 and 2. Now, chapter 1 spells out the first 6 days, and then chapter 2 gives us the seventh day, where after 6 days of creating, God rests or ceases from his creation activity. And then day 6 is expanded upon in chapter 2. So there's some detail given to the creation of man. Now, we don't believe the evolutionary scheme that we are currently inundated with, unfortunately, within the scientific community, at least the secular scientific community, because the evidence for creation is vast and overwhelming. The evidence for evolution is non-existent. As a matter of fact, the need for evidence is really what we want to look at from a scientific standpoint anyways, if we're going to adhere to any form of origins. In other words, how things started and how they developed over time. Now, Darwin, when he wrote his Origin of the Species, made a specific notation to the fact that he expected there to eventually be found in the fossil record many transitional forms that would prove small successive modifications over long periods of time that would demonstrate, at least in his mind, that one thing was changing to another. Now, there is no evidence that exists today, nor has there ever been, that any species changes to another. Natural selection may be the definition technically of evolution, but natural selection only speaks about modifications within a species, but never the change of one to the other. That's pretty much a story that's established to make the scenario fit together. Because if Darwin was around today, by his own statement, he said he would abandon the theory, his own theory, if those small successive modifications could not be found in the fossil record. Now, to that fact, as a side note, a number of years ago, Niles Eldredge and Jay Gould, who used to be the paleontologist at Harvard University, they authored a paper on punctuated equilibrium, really demonstrating the fact from their perspective that because there was no evidence in the fossil record of transitional forms, and again, these are ardent evolutionists, secularists, their conclusion is that the changes from one species to another must punctuate to the next level without leaving any evidence behind, which I find quite interesting that you have a paper that tries to demonstrate the fact that the evidence that you have for your theory is the fact that there is none. It's quite interesting, at least it doesn't appear to be very scientific to me. So the evolutionists have tried to deal with this issue for years. They've never dealt with it successfully. Unfortunately, within the Christian community, there are those that believe in what we call theistic evolution. Now, the problem with theistic evolution is not only, first of all, do we have the same problem as the secular evolutionists, in other words, there is no evidence for it, but number two, the Bible lays out a different scenario. For example, evolution tells us that man is the result of a common ancestor to apes, an ancestor that doesn't exist anymore, again, conveniently. However, the Bible tells us that God created man from the dust of the earth, not from a previously existing animal. In evolution, we have a different sequence of how the animals were supposed to have developed over time, what came from what. It's a different order and different sequence within the Bible. So things are backwards, they're a bit upside down. And the reason I say that, not to get off anymore into evolution, but the reason I say that is because if we want to be consistent with the Bible, if we want to say that we believe what the Bible teaches, then we cannot be a theistic evolutionist. We cannot say God used evolution. Now, if you want to make the early chapters of Genesis a myth, if you want to pretend that they're not real, you want to discard them as really being the Word of God, then you can believe whatever really you want to believe, evolution or any other theory that you want, because it doesn't really matter at that point. You're just making it up. However, God was the only one that was there. We did have a beginning to the universe. He's the one that began it. And so the creation week tells us how he did that in 6 literal 24-hour days. So you may ask, well, how do you know it's 24-hour days? Well, Moses, who's the same author that wrote Genesis, also wrote Exodus. In Exodus chapter 20, as he's listing out the law for the first time, he tells us that Israel was supposed to work 6 days and rest on the Sabbath to worship. Now, he says, because as God created the world in 6 days and rested on the seventh, so you work 6 days and you rest on the seventh. He made a direct correlation to the creation week. There's really no way to misunderstand that. You would have to impose some precondition on top of that and make it say something that Moses is not having it say in order for it to change. Look, there are Hebrew scholars that clearly will agree that if you take Genesis as written, it is 6 literal 24-hour days. So that's how we take it. That's what the grammar tells us. That's what the context tells us. That's what the Bible later on confirms. And science supports that, all the scientific findings. So chapter 1 and 2, the creation week, and we see that this is actually what we call the first dispensation, which we're not going to get into dispensations. I did some other videos on that you can watch. But this is the time of innocence, and God is dealing with Adam and Eve based on the fact that there is no sin in the world, and they are innocent. They have not sinned. There's no experience with sin. And so the only thing they need to do is stay away from one tree in the garden. And the issue with that tree at this point is either they or God will determine for them what is right and wrong. Either God is the one that will determine morality effectively for man, or man will make his own decision. Well, we see they made the wrong decision in that. So we have the fall in chapter 3 where Adam and Eve are supposed to be ruling over creation. We discover that Eve ends up having a conversation with creation, which is really not the direction that we would want to see them go. However, she falls in that conversation to the place where the devil deceives her, Adam disobeys, they both end up eating, and then they fall into sin. They're separated from God spiritually, eventually to die physically. And this is the second dispensation, the second condition that man is put under. Now he is driven really by his conscience, because God is not adding laws or criteria for people to live by. So man is dealing with his conscience, and we get off into chapter 4. We see the development of civilization. This is where Cain murders his brother because God doesn't accept Cain's sacrifice, and he's angry at Abel, who is really the first prophet. Chapter 5 is the death chapter, except for Enoch, who escapes death, who ends up really becoming, eventually, looking back, a type of the church, being taken out before the judgment of God falls upon the world in the worldwide flood. Chapter 6 to 8 is the worldwide flood. We see that, again, what is stated, it's impossible to take the Bible as written and get around the fact that the flood was worldwide. Now, this would certainly affect all the dating methods that they use today, if that was the case. Additionally, a local flood would be absolutely useless in this situation. They would not have to put animals on the ark. And again, the animals that were on the ark were not all the species today. They were the basic couples that make up the families that create the sub category of species. But on the ark, there would be all the animals, but that would be unnecessary. And also, Noah could have moved. He didn't need to spend 120 years building a boat to survive a local flood. So none of that actually makes sense. And so, again, we believe it is a worldwide flood. It says that it was a worldwide flood a number of times. God usually needs to only say something once and not have to repeat himself, which he does in this case over and over again, to convince us that it is worldwide. Chapter 9, we have the new world when Noah gets off the ark, and then God actually gives some added conditions, and so we would call this the third dispensation, or time of human government, where God now has Noah ruling over his offspring. They can eat any food they like, any animal, which previous was restricted, and then additionally, they can now exercise capital punishment because murder is not allowed. The reason it's not allowed is because man does not have the right to destroy the image of God, and man is made in the image of God, so man cannot destroy that. He does not have that right. Now, God had to tell them that they could eat animals, and that was all food for them, because the same does not apply to animals. Animals are not made in the image of God, so they can be used for food for man, and that's why the distinction was made. Chapter 10, we have a divided world. Now, there is some evidence to the fact that all the continents could have been together at that point and then divided and spread apart. However, the key to the chapter is more the division of languages and how the people were distributed throughout the known world at the time from Shem, Ham, and Japheth and their offspring. Now, this is made clear. Chapter 10 and 11 work together. Chapter 11 is the Tower of Babel. That's where, again, Nimrod was building the tower, the nations were all together unified in idolatry, and God had to come down and separate them, which is why we all have different languages. And as these people separated out to different parts of the world, and you had groups that would isolate within a generation or two, they've discovered that dominant characteristics will come out, which is why people look different in different areas of the world. So it's not rocket science, it's just a little bit of genetics to provide that information to us. And again, the Bible supports all that we eventually discover scientifically. It's letting us know ahead of time. The second part of Genesis, chapter 12 to 50, is really the creation of the nation of Israel. So this again would be the fourth dispensation, because we start off with Abraham's call in chapters 12 to 20, and there's an unconditional covenant that is given to Abraham. This unconditional covenant is really a promise that is then ratified into a covenant. We'll get into a little bit more detail in a minute on that. But then we have the sacrifice, a birth and sacrifice of Isaac in chapter 21 to 22. And then in chapter 23, we see Sarah's wife Abraham dies and is buried. Chapter 24, Isaac finds a bride in Rebekah. They get married, and then they have Jacob and Esau, and then Jacob ends up escaping where he steals the birthright, goes and lives with Rachel's brother, Laban, and then eventually ends up marrying, Rebekah's brother, Laban, and eventually marries Rachel to have his family with the Jacob's dozen, or the 12 sons that Jacob has that fathers the 12 tribes. In chapter 34 to 38, we see these 12 kids as they develop. Not a great family, but it's the one that God used. And again, we have to remember that God is functioning right now with these people in an unconditional covenant, which means people don't have to do anything in order to fulfill God's plan. God will make sure it happens. And like I said, we'll talk about that in a minute. Now, we have in chapter 39 to 41, his son Joseph, who was sold into slavery down in Egypt. The other 11 planned on killing him, but they eventually decided to sell him and get some money for him. They pretended that he was dead to his father Jacob. Joseph had some favoritism, had some dreams that he expressed to his brothers and to his parents that created a little bit of an issue. They hated him for it, but God was giving him the dreams, and then it is through his being sent to Egypt that God fulfills his plan with the whole nation. Joseph eventually meets his brothers in chapter 42 to 46. They're discovered, and then chapter 47 to 50, Jacob and all the rest of the family come down to Egypt and then are given a place over in Goshen, an isolated area within Egypt, to develop into 2 to 3 million people. So we have in chapters 1 to 11, in the first section, some key verses. Obviously, chapter 1, verse 1. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. So we have time, starting with the word beginning. We have space with heavens. I think people often don't recognize that in order to have the universe, God had to create the space that everything is in. That is part of the physical universe, the space itself. And then matter, the earth. So time, space, and matter had their start, their creation, their beginning in the first verse of the Bible when God spoke everything into existence. In chapter 126, God makes man in his image and gives the indication that the Godhead is more than one. He said, "Let us make man in our image after our likeness." And that's not the us of angels, because man is not made in the image of angels, but he's made in the image of God alone. We have the first prophecy in chapter 3 after Adam and Eve sin. that the seed of the woman, which a woman doesn't have a seed, so it is a hint at the virgin birth, will crush the head of the serpent that deceived Eve. First prophecy of the coming of Jesus Christ so early in the book of Genesis. We have the first murder, Cain with Abel, in chapter 4. Chapter 6, we have Satan's first attempt to destroy the human race and thwart the coming of this deliverer. Now, the coming of the deliverer needed to be human. So Jesus Christ is both God and man, but he is fully man. The demonic activity that is seen in chapter 6, in the first few verses of Genesis, shows that Satan was trying to corrupt the genetics of the human race so that there would be enough of an admixture that it would prevent the deliverer from actually being born as a regular full human being without any genetically deviant offspring that he was trying to work into the human race at that point. When it says that Noah found grace in the eyes of God and that he was perfect in his generation, he was genetically perfect, which is what it speaks to, as well as a righteous man. So he had faith and he had not been infected with whatever was going on during that time. 7:16, the first global judgment, God brought the animals to the ark and shut the door. So God not only had Noah build the ark, but God was the one that brought the animals. And again, unnecessary for a local flood. Genesis 9, 5, and 6, the first command for capital punishment to be imposed, which we talked about. Later on in Genesis 9, we have the first sign of a covenant to ratify the promise of God to man not to flood the world again. In other words, a global flood. We've had plenty of local floods and tsunamis, but we have never had that same deluge around the whole globe. And the rainbow is the sign of that covenant. Chapter 10, again, Nimrod, the first man to gather effectively a worldwide rebellion and lead people into idolatry, which meant that when God separated the nations in chapter 11 into these different languages and divided out the people, that all the nations that sprung from that were infected with this idolatry as they left there. So the second part, the creation of the nation, we have chapter 12 through 50 and some key verses. 12, 1 to 3, God needs an uncorrupted nation since the others are corrupted from Babel, and that's why he calls Abraham, or Abram at the time, from Ur the Chaldees, and tells him that he's going to make a nation of him, gives him the promise of a nation, in other words, offspring, a land for them to live in, and the promise of redemption to the rest of the nations through him. Chapter 14, we see again Melchizedek is introduced. I explained that earlier. Chapter 15, an important chapter, God declares his promises will be through Isaac. He is yet to be born, but it is to be Abraham's offspring with Sarah. And he ratifies this promise, makes it into an unconditional covenant. In other words, a covenant that Abraham does not have to do something to fulfill it. God's going to make sure that he gives him land, which would be Canaan, seed, which is the descendants that will make up his nation through Isaac, and then the redemptive blessing of how the Messiah will come through his lineage to bring salvation to the world. In Genesis 15:6, justification by faith is seen in Abraham. Paul uses this to demonstrate and reveal that it really is the only way in the Bible that we are taught that God accepts man, or that we are delivered, or our salvation. And it's apart from any works of human merit that any man can produce. So salvation is by faith alone. There's nothing that we can offer God. And this is established again early in Genesis, codified really in Abraham, and then expanded upon by Paul. Really, it is the theme of justification throughout the Bible, which is why Paul uses it in Romans and also in the book of Galatians. Genesis 17, we have the sign of this covenant with Abraham, which is circumcision. So all Abraham's offspring will be circumcised to show that they are under this unconditional covenant. Chapter 19, God delivers Lot and his two daughters by using angels to remove them from Sodom and Gomorrah, and because of their wickedness, and that he destroys Sodom. Chapter 21, God confirms that it is through Isaac that the nation that he has chosen will bring the Messiah into the world, and Isaac, your seed, will be called. Chapter 22, the first time the word love appears in the Bible, and that is between the love of a father to a son. God tells Abraham, take your son, talking about Isaac, your only son that you love. And so this is, again, to model an example, the love that our Heavenly Father has for his Son, the Lord Jesus Christ. So this is the model of love and the example of love that we are to have. God's promises in chapter 22 to provide himself a sacrifice to ultimately deliver man from our sinful ruin. Now, this is when God had told Abraham to offer his son Isaac. And again, as he was offering him, he stayed his hand and said that there was a ram caught in the thicket, and he was to do that, get that ram and offer him a sacrifice. And so God's intention was never to have Isaac offered. It was always really the devotion of Abraham to God. Chapter 22 again, it says, God again confirms that it will be through Isaac that the Messiah will come into the world. And then as we move on in the chapters, chapter 25, we see Esau and Jacob. They're the two heads of nations. As a matter of fact, from their first mention, their mom is told that she's having a tough pregnancy, and God says there are two nations warring in your womb. And that war continued as they were birthed as kids, and then as they developed into nations. Remember, Esau is the father of the Edomites. So God will bring the Messiah, however, by God's choice through Jacob. Now, God knows everything. He can't not know everything. He's God. And he knows everything at once. He doesn't have to learn it over time. So God knew that Esau would certainly be somebody that had no spiritual desire, and Jacob did, even though Jacob went about it in a very carnal way. But either way, God was always going to plan to bring the messianic line through Jacob. So Esau shows he's not interested in spiritual things because of the incident where he wants to trade his birthright for some food. And through that, Jacob shows that he is interested in spiritual things, though he didn't go about it in a great way. Now, as we get further on, we find that Joseph has two dreams that result in his brothers hating him and his father rebuking him. So Joseph ends up obviously being one of Jacob's kids, and he's the one that ends up getting sold into slavery and brought down to Egypt as a slave. He ends up in Potiphar's house. Eventually, he's moved around a couple of times, and then he ends up going to Pharaoh and interpreting a dream for him, since he interpreted some dreams from the butler and the baker in prison. And then Pharaoh ends up getting wind of that and then called him to interpret his dream. And then Joseph is actually exalted to the place second only to Pharaoh, and was running or managing, overseeing the nation of Egypt. Tremendous position. He's the type of Christ who is rejected by his brothers, but used to preserve the family of Jacob or Israel. Again, this is brought out by Stephen in Acts chapter 7. In chapter 45, Joseph finally reveals himself to his brothers as they come down to get some food in Egypt because of the famine that's up in the land of Canaan, which is what they will be preserved from. Jacob and his family eventually go to Egypt to be preserved in chapter 46. They are given the land of Goshen so that they can have an isolated area to be safe and to grow. as a nation. In 48, Jacob overrules the birth order for priority with Ephraim and Manasseh. Manasseh was the older, Ephraim the younger. They were Joseph's children, and usually the older is the one to receive the blessing, but Jacob reverses the order, and we see eventually Ephraim was a larger nation and one that had prominence. Jacob blesses his 12 children and prophesies over them. In chapter 49 and in chapter 50, we see that Joseph's faith is seen in God's promise to Abraham, that he believes that and that he wants his body taken when they depart from Egypt. This is referenced in Hebrews chapter 11 as an act of faith on Joseph's part. He believed the promise given to Abraham and knew that God was going to bring this nation, though they were in Egypt, to the land of Canaan and provide the fulfillment of that promise. So Genesis ends with, first of all, Israel in the land, isolated to the land of Goshen, awaiting the promised deliverer. So Israel, they had grown to probably between 2 and 3 million people by the time the book of Genesis is coming to a close, and the book of Exodus really will take up there. The Bible wouldn't make sense. Let me slide that little image over there. The Bible wouldn't make sense from Exodus forward without the preparation and the foundation laid down of Genesis. So if Genesis was removed from the Bible, it would not be a comprehensible book. You wouldn't really be able to understand the Bible because so much of it refers back to Genesis, and so many of the doctrines and things that are established in the Bible start in Genesis. We wouldn't know anything about them without it. And then obviously Exodus opens where Genesis leaves off. So that is the book of Genesis. I hope that the overview has helped you, and as always, I pray that God continue to bless you as you continue to study His Word.